A most inconvenient impression. Chapter 1. It is a truth not yet universally acknowledged beyond a few drawing rooms of Waterdeep and certain greener reaches of the Sword Coast, that a household of lively dispositions must, sooner or later, be thrown into confusion by the arrival of distinguished company. The house in question, though spoken of by some as if it were a proper estate, and by others as if it were no more than an overgrown refuge for strays, was under the care of Halcyne, a gentleman whose habits were so little governed by fashion that many people of excellent breeding found themselves unable to account for him at all. He had over time, and with a patience which society mistook for indifference, gathered about him a family not formed by blood, but by affection, circumstance, and a series of events too complicated for polite conversation. Those who loved order found the arrangement suspicious. Those who knew the inhabitants found it inevitable. Of this household, Carlach was the most beloved by all who met her, for she possessed such openness of temper, such warmth of heart, and such an absence of vanity, that even those determined to dislike her were generally defeated in the attempt. Shadowheart, who spoke less and observed more, had an expression which suggested either thoughtfulness or disapproval, according as one had offended her already. Minsk, who was considered by himself a great guardian of the family, and by everyone else a danger to every settled plan, moved through life with the happy conviction that sincerity was a sufficient substitute for prudence. Vesta, whose spirits were lively, whose opinions were quick, and whose eyes too often betrayed both amusement and intelligence at once, was the one most likely to laugh at folly, and therefore, by a very natural consequence, the one most likely to provoke it. "You are smiling before we have even arrived," said Shadowheart, as they were shown from their carriage before the assembly rooms. "I am only preparing myself," replied Vesta. "If one must endure a crowded hall, overheated conversation, and at least 3 ladies pretending not to examine one's dress, one ought to enter with a sense of humour." Carlach laughed. "Oh, come now. It might be lovely." "It might," said Vesta, "and Minsk might pass an evening without causing alarm." Minsk, who had just then turned in alarm because a footman bore a silver tray too near Carlach's elbow, drew himself up. "I cause no alarm. I prevent it. There is a difference, and Boo knows it." "Boo," said Shadowheart, "is the only creature here whose judgment I trust entirely." Halcyne, who had descended after them with an ease that made the entire spectacle of public assembly look faintly absurd, regarded the bright windows and the stream of carriages with tranquil amusement. "You need not stay long," he said. "Observe what is worth observing. Dance if you wish. Refuse if you prefer. No lasting injury need come of an evening such as this." "That," said Vesta, slipping her arm through his for a moment before they entered, "is why your counsel is universally considered unfit for society." "And yet," said Halcyne, "you continue to prefer it." "I prefer many things society would object to. I have noticed." This exchange, though slight, was enough to put Vesta in the best humour possible for encountering those persons who believed themselves fitted to regulate the pleasures of others. And as the rooms were already crowded with silk, jewels, military coats, studied indifference, and over-eager civility, she had immediate occasion to exercise it. The occasion of the assembly was, in part, the arrival in the neighbourhood of Mr. Will Ravengard, a gentleman of excellent address, agreeable manners, and such ready good humour that he had not been 10 minutes in the room before he was pronounced charming by half the company and admirable by the other. He possessed, besides, the great advantage of appearing sincerely pleased by everyone he met, an accomplishment less common than those who do not possess it imagine. With him came Mr. Gale de Carrios, whose reputation had preceded him sufficiently to prepare every hearer either to be impressed or intimidated. He was spoken of as a man of learning, refinement, and consequence. A gentleman connected with circles lofty enough to inspire envy in the ambitious and suspicion in the independent. With them, too, was Minthara Benre of Menzoberranzan, a lady whose presence admitted of no easy interpretation, for she moved through society not as one seeking its approval, but as one long accustomed to commanding her own. Her elegance was exact without ornament, her composure so unyielding that admiration, where it existed, was rarely separated from unease. She was known in Waterdeep not by familiarity, but by reputation. And though she was often observed in the company of Mr. Decarios, it was generally understood that such an association reflected no dependence on her part, but rather a tolerance, selective, and not to be presumed upon. Some little distance behind, or rather through, as if all crowds were a temporary inconvenience to be endured by superior beings, moved Lady Laezel, whose relation to the party was imperfectly understood by most present, and of no comfort whatever to those who attempted conversation with her. "Oh," cried Carlac softly, though with no softness in the warmth of her delight, "that must be Mr. Ravengard." "And which one is the terrible scholar of Waterdeep?" asked Vesta. "The one," said Shadowheart, after a glance, "who looks as if he has already found something wanting in the room." Vesta followed her eye and saw Mr. Decarios standing near one of the tall windows, listening while Will addressed him with all the ease of long friendship. He was, she thought, handsome in the way some men are handsome, only after one has been told they are clever. His figure elegant, his countenance fine, his whole manner composed almost to excess. There was nothing in him to invite immediate ease. One felt, on first observing him, that he might very well be admired, but would not much care to assist in the pleasure of anyone who did not earn it. "That must recommend him highly," said Vesta. "Nothing improves a public gathering so much as a gentleman who plainly resents being at it." "You are determined against him already," said Carlach. "Not at all. I am only grateful. He has given me an opinion before forcing me to ask for one." If Vesta had been disposed to greater generosity, the sight of Will crossing at that moment to request the honour of Carlach's hand for the next dance might have softened her towards his companions by reflection. There was so much sincerity in his pleasure, so little artifice in the attention he paid, that everyone who saw them together foresaw at the very least a mutual preference before the evening was half over. Carlach, who glowed with happiness and attempted none of the coy reluctance recommended by books of conduct, accepted him at once. Will looked as if the room had improved beyond calculation. "He is done for," said Vesta. "In the happiest way," replied Halsin. Minsk, meanwhile, had fixed upon the military bearing of one gentleman the jewels of another, and the refreshments of a third as deserving equal scrutiny, and was prevented from addressing all three only by Shadowheart's firm hold upon his sleeve. "He cannot surely be left alone," Vesta murmured. "On the contrary," said Shadowheart, "he always is. That is why disaster finds him so easily." It was in the interval before the next set was formed that Vesta, standing with Shadowheart near one of the columns, first heard Mr. Decarios speak of her. It was not designed for her ear, though not so low as absolute prudence might have made it. Will, flushed from dancing and with all the benevolent enthusiasm of a man convinced the world was full of delight, had returned to his friend and urged him to join the set. "You dance little enough for 10 men," said he. "You cannot stand there all evening as if you are composing an argument against happiness itself. Come, there are several ladies here who would oblige you." "I do not doubt it," replied Gale, his glance moving over the room with too much quickness for vanity and too much reserve for ease. "But I am not inclined to engage merely because a room demands it." "You are impossible." "I am discriminating." Will laughed. "There is Miss Vesta if you require a challenge. She has wit enough to keep pace with you, which is more than can be said for most." Gale's eyes, guided by Will's, fell for a moment on Vesta. There was no impertinence in the look. Indeed, she might later have admitted there was thought in it, and even interest. But at the time, all she perceived was composure, hesitation, and then an answer given with the most unfortunate exactness. "She is certainly striking," he said, "but appears very decided. I should not like to spend half a dance discovering all the ways in which she disapproves of me." Will laughed again, as men will when determined to find their friends agreeable. Vesta did not. Shadowheart turned slightly. "Well," she said, "that was almost civil." "Almost," said Vesta, whose eyes remained on the dancers though she saw none of them. "Then I tremble to imagine what, in his circle, is considered an insult." "I did say he looked dissatisfied." "Yes. I had not understood that he meant to be dissatisfied with me personally. It is gratifying to be chosen." Shadowheart, who knew that Vesta's tone had become lighter only because her pride had been touched, made no answer. If the matter had ended there, Mr. Dekarios might have remained nothing more to Vesta than a conceited scholar with handsome features and unfortunate habits of speech. But fate, which often delights in oversupplying an impression, had prepared a contrast. Not half an hour later, there appeared at Vesta's side a gentleman so perfectly formed for immediate favour that had he been contrived in answer to Mr. Dekarios's deficiencies, he could scarcely have been more effectual. Mr. Astarion Ancunin was known by name to some in the room and by appearance to all as soon as he entered it. There was in his air that polished ease which suggests both intimate knowledge of the world and a private amusement at its expense. His smile seemed bestowed rather than offered. His beauty, too remarkable to be ignored, had that dangerous quality which leads sensible people to behave, for a few minutes at least, as if they were not sensible at all. He bowed with elegance enough to flatter and just enough irreverence to amuse. "I ought to apologize," said he, "for making my entrance so late. It gives the impression that I wish to be noticed, which would be unbearably vulgar." Vesta, who had no intention of rewarding vanity and yet found herself smiling, replied, "You must not fear the charge. A truly vulgar person would have made some effort to deny it." His eyes brightened. "Ah, so you are Vesta. I see my reputation has survived me." "It has done more than survive. It has been greatly improved in the telling. I was assured you possessed wit, but not warned that you employ it immediately." That was charitable. Forewarning might have allowed you to retreat. "And miss the only interesting conversation in the room? Never." Shadowheart beside her regarded him with an expression of composed distrust which might have discouraged a lesser performer. Astarion only inclined his head to her as if her disapproval were a title he had every intention of earning. "Miss Shadowheart," said he with faultless politeness. "Sir." That was almost warm. "It is all I could manage on so short an acquaintance. Then I shall treasure it doubly." Vesta ought perhaps to have been warned by how easily he adapted himself to each reply, how readily he made another person's wit seem the cause of his own. But where Gale's reserve had offended her into vigilance, Astarion's ease disarmed it. He asked nothing in the vulgar mode of interrogation. Instead, he drew out a thought, returned it ornamented, and made agreement look like discovery. "You have been here long enough to form an opinion of our distinguished guests, I think," he said, after a few more exchanges, and with just the indifference proper to so innocent a topic. "Or is it too cruel to ask? It depends on whether they deserve mercy." "Oh, almost certainly not." Vesta allowed herself another smile. "Mr. Ravengard seems to deserve every good opinion." "He generally does. It is a tiresome excellence. And Mr. Dekarios?" Astarion's expression altered only by the smallest degree. Yet that degree suggested a history, a reluctance, perhaps even generosity struggling with restraint. "Mr. Dekarios," he said, "has every advantage a man could wish for. Birth, learning, accomplishment. admiration. One must allow him his peculiarities. The world has, after all, been very kind to him. This, delivered without bitterness, and with an air almost too careless to be artful, did more to prejudice Vesta than a direct accusation could have accomplished. You speak as though you know him well. Well enough to admire his talents, said Astarion. Not well enough, perhaps, to profit by his regard. Shadowheart looked at him then with greater steadiness than before. And yet you speak of him with remarkable restraint, she said. How severe, he returned pleasantly. You make moderation sound suspicious. I find many things suspicious. How fatiguing that must be. Less fatiguing, said she, than being disappointed repeatedly. Astarion laughed, not offended, but entertained, as one might be by a cat which had chosen to show its claws. Vesta, though diverted, thought Shadowheart more abrupt than the occasion required. At the far side of the room, Carlac and Will had just concluded another dance, and were standing together in such obvious enjoyment of one another's company that even the least romantic observer could have named it. Will bent towards her with eager attention. Carlac answered him with such frank delight that several ladies of stricter manners began, already, to call it imprudent. Minthara, seated near Lady Lae'zel, observed the pair with cool displeasure. Your Mr. Ravengard commits himself rapidly, she said to Gale. He dances, said Gale. He advertises. He is happy? Minthara's gaze shifted, following some line invisible to most and obvious to him. And you are distracted. I am attending. You are failing at it. Gale, who had indeed looked more than once in the direction where Vesta stood, drew himself a little more upright. Must every glance be interpreted? When it is so poorly concealed, yes. Lady Lae'zel, who had the remarkable ability to make even silence sound contemptuous, gave a short exhale that might have served for a laugh in a less formidable person. This gathering is inefficient, she said. They circle, they flatter, they speculate, and call it pleasure. If alliances are to be made, they should be stated. If not, all this ornament is waste. That, murmured Minthara, is the first useful thing anyone has said this evening. Gale said nothing, which among his intimates was often a stronger sign of inward occupation than speech. For Vesta's part, however, the evening had already divided itself very neatly into what she should like and what she should laugh at. She liked Will, liked still better the happiness he gave Carlac, liked even the absurdity of Minsk, declaring that the musicians lacked proper battle discipline. She laughed at Minthara's severity, at Lady Lae'zel's rigid disdain, and most particularly at Mr. Dekarios, whose reserve she now considered less the mark of depth than a very overvalued self-command. As for Astarion was delightful. When, later in the evening, he secured from her the promise of a dance at the next assembly by suggesting that refusal would break a heart he did not specify, she answered that he seemed to possess far too many to suffer from the loss of one. On the contrary, he said softly as he bowed over her hand, I have always found the right one difficult to come by. It was exactly the sort of thing Vesta would, in calmer judgment, have called practiced nonsense, but the calm judgment of young women at crowded assemblies has often been overestimated by those who are no longer young. Shadowheart, as they prepared at last to leave, waited until Astarion had turned away before speaking. You like him? I do, said Vesta lightly. He is too smooth. Would you prefer him rude? I would prefer him sincere. Vesta glanced back once towards the room. Gale was standing beside Minthara, listening with visible impatience to something Lady Lae'zel pronounced as if issuing orders before a campaign. At that same moment, whether by chance or some contrary instinct, he looked across the room and met Vesta's eyes. There was no mockery in his countenance then, only thought, and something like regret before the look was broken. She turned away at once. If sincerity is to be judged by awkward silences and an unfortunate opinion of me, she said, then perhaps Mr. Decarios may yet prove a saint. Shadowheart did not smile. That is not what I said. No, replied Vesta. It rarely is. And with that they departed. Karlash full of happiness, Minsk full of observations, Shadowheart full of doubts, and Vesta full of a first impression which, like many first impressions, had all the force of certainty and very little of truth.